They said no man should enter the Ozark woods after dusk. Not the hunters, not the travelers, not even the men who had lived all their lives at the edge of the trees. But 30 men, strangers to caution and seekers of adventure, or perhaps greed, ignored the warnings in the autumn of 1888. They laughed at the stories, the whispered tales of men disappearing, of shadows moving when there should be none. They carried rifles and lanterns, maps and compasses, confidence and arrogance, each believing they would be the first to conquer the forest's secrets. None of them returned. What happened in those woods is not recorded in the newspapers, not fully. The local sheriffs noted missing persons. The villagers murmured warnings, but nothing could account for the empty hollows, the abandoned campsites, the single boot lying in a stream, as if its owner had simply vanished from the earth. Who were these men? Hunters, fathers, sons, and what did they encounter that the forest would not release? Some claim the hunters heard voices at twilight, faint and melodic, calling names they did not recognize. Others insist they saw movement between the trees, silhouettes taller than any man, shifting unnaturally with the fog. One thing was certain. The forest did not let them leave, and the Ozarks kept their secret with a patience that stretched across decades. It begins simply. A group of men, eager to hunt, eager to test their skill, stepping into the woods with lanterns and rifles, their laughter echoing faintly through the thinning light of the setting sun. But with every step, the shadows lengthened differently. The wind seemed to shift against them, and the familiar sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of crickets, the distant calls of owls, carried an edge, a warning that went unheard. No one knows exactly when the first hunter realized something was wrong. Perhaps it was the way the mist clung to the undergrowth, curling around his boots, or perhaps it was the way the trees seemed to bend slightly toward him, following his movement. Companions who had been just steps ahead suddenly disappeared behind the fog, leaving only a faint whisper of a footfall, a sigh in the wind, a presence that could not be named. They called to each other, voices cracking, hearts pounding, yet the forest returned only silence. By nightfall, the hunters were scattered. Lanterns swung erratically, the light swallowed by shadows that seemed thicker than the darkness itself. The trail they had followed earlier had vanished as if it had never existed. Every step forward brought confusion, every glance over the shoulder brought unease. And yet, they pressed on. Who among them could admit fear in front of 30 men, each armed and strong? Who could admit the creeping, whispering sensation that the trees were alive with eyes, that the very air was resisting their passage? Some villagers, observing from a distance, claimed they heard laughter in the twilight, high and childlike, carried across the hills in a way that chilled the blood. Others swore they saw lantern light moving where no one should be, pausing, shifting, vanishing, leaving only emptiness. Days passed, and then weeks, before anyone ventured to investigate. 30 men had entered. None returned. Not a single rifle, not a single piece of clothing, not even footprints leading out of the forest. Only a silence, deep and unsettling, blanketing the Ozarks. So, we ask again, who were these hunters? What did they encounter? Were they claimed by the earth, consumed by shadows, or drawn into something that cannot be named? These questions, unanswered for over a century, still linger in the whispers of the Ozark wind, in the fog that rolls down valleys in the evenings, and in the hearts of anyone foolish enough to tread too far into the trees after sunset. And now, as you watch this story unfold, consider this. If 30 men disappeared in those woods more than 100 years ago, What waits for someone brave or foolish enough to step inside today? Where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments, if you dare. The Ozark woods are different from any forest you might know. The air here is heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a richness that seeps into your lungs with every step. Even in the late afternoon, the sun struggles to pierce the thick canopy above. Shafts of light fall in narrow beams, illuminating patches of moss, the gnarled roots of ancient trees, and the soft, black soil that seems to swallow sound as soon as it hits the ground. Every footfall becomes deliberate, every whisper amplified, and then absorbed, as if the forest itself is listening. Branches hang low, twisted like arthritic fingers, scraping against clothing and scraping against skin, leaving faint scratches that sting long after the moment passes. The air is colder than it should be for that time of year, carrying with it an undercurrent of moisture that seeps into clothing and chills bones. The wind shifts unpredictably, sometimes carrying the faint, unplaceable scent of smoke, other times the sharp tang of something metallic, almost like iron, though no source is visible. Beneath the canopy, shadows gather in folds and hollows, moving with a rhythm that is impossible to track. A boulder that seemed solid a moment ago may, in the next instant, appear different, its edges softened or elongated. Moss creeps up trunks in unnatural patterns, forming shapes that might be letters or faces if one stares too long. The forest seems aware of observation, as if it measures curiosity and responds accordingly, allowing glimpses of the impossible, just enough to unsettle, but never enough to fully reveal itself. Sound behaves strangely here. A bird call from one direction may echo from another, distorted, delayed, like a memory of a sound rather than the sound itself. Crickets whisper in erratic patterns, ceasing abruptly when stepped upon, only to begin again, once attention drifts. The wind itself seems alive, carrying faint noises, a cough, a rustle, a laugh, that vanish when one turns to investigate. Hunters, moving with confidence only moments before, begin to hesitate. Paths that seemed obvious dissolve into undergrowth, trails twist back on themselves, and landmarks lose consistency. What was a familiar tree or boulder a minute ago now appears miles away. Underfoot, the ground is deceptive. Thick layers of moss and fallen leaves conceal hidden roots, stones, and soft earth, making each step uncertain. Some hollows seem deeper than they should be, as though they drop into a void rather than the root-clotted soil puddles collect in depressions, perfectly still, reflecting the mottled canopy above, but occasionally rippling without cause, disturbing the reflection with an uncanny grace, as if something beneath moves unseen. The hunters would have noticed details that escape casual attention. A bird frozen mid-flight in a shaft of sunlight, its wings outstretched unnaturally long, the bark on a tree patterned like runes or markings, not human-made, but echoing a sense of intent. The feeling that the air itself is pressing inward, funneling toward a point unseen, guiding attention, urging steps in a certain direction. The mind begins to weigh every shadow, every crackle of leaves, every distant sound. Fatigue becomes a phantom companion, anxiety its echo. The longer one lingers, the more the woods claim attention, until a single thought, that you are being watched, that you are being measured, dominates all else. And yet, despite the growing discomfort, the hunters pressed forward. Their lanterns illuminated only a small circle ahead, the rest of the forest cloaked in shifting darkness. Every movement of a branch, every flicker of a shadow, every whisper of wind seemed amplified, loaded with significance that might be imagined or real. Their voices, when raised, carried into the woods and returned, altered, twisted, sometimes in tones that resembled the familiar, sometimes with a cadence that made the hairs on their necks rise. The forest had begun to shape their perception, bending reality slowly, almost imperceptibly, until the line between caution and panic blurred. Streams and small creeks interrupted their path. Water flowed cold and clear, reflecting a distorted canopy and shapes that might or might not be fish, shadows, or something entirely else. Stones along the banks seemed to shift subtly, rearranging themselves when backs were turned. Moss clung to surfaces in thick layers, and occasionally, in the corner of the eye, one might catch a brief flicker of movement that vanished when confronted directly. The hunters started to speak less, listen more, feeling a presence they could neither name nor confront. Above, the canopy thickened as the sun dipped lower. Shafts of light shortened, shadows lengthened, and the forest seemed to lean inward, funneling attention and movement towards something unseen. The mist began to rise from the valleys, curling around roots, slipping between trees, blanketing the forest floor with a damp, cold embrace. Shapes emerged within the fog, only to vanish when looked at directly. A branch might stretch like an arm, a boulder might look like a crouching figure, and the hunters, men who prided themselves on bravery, felt the slow, creeping insistence that the forest was no longer simply wood and soil, but an active, observing entity. Every detail mattered now. The distant caw of a raven, the hollow sound of a tree trunk when struck, the barely audible snap of a twig. The forest recorded everything, even the smallest footstep, every whispered conversation, every hesitant glance over the shoulder. And the hunters were leaving marks, trails, echoes. The longer they lingered, the more these marks accumulated, creating a record of their presence that the woods would remember, and perhaps respond to. By the time night fully descended, darkness did not simply fall. It settled, dense and complete. Lanterns were swallowed almost instantly by the fog and shadows, turning familiar paths into corridors of ambiguity. Sounds became distorted, echoes stretched, and the forest no longer obeyed expectation. Hunters could hear their companions calling, but the voice was wrong. Too high, too low, carrying emotions that did not match the situation. A pause and the sound would shift elsewhere, leaving only the wind and the faint hum of unseen movement. It was here, in this oppressive, disorienting, ever-shifting environment, that the true terror began. Not with monsters or immediate threat, but with perception itself. When familiar landmarks lose meaning, when the eyes betray the mind, when confidence erodes into doubt, and when the forest subtly asserts that it is in control. And so the hunters moved, unsure of direction, unsure of distance, unsure of each other, drawn further into the heart of the Ozarks, where answers, if answers existed, were never meant to be found. Notice every shadow, every flicker in the fog. Could you walk through this forest alone tonight? Comment if you think you could survive the Ozarks after dark. The first night in the Ozark woods had settled like a weight around the hunters' shoulders. Lanterns swung in the hands of men who now moved cautiously, their earlier confidence replaced by an awareness that the forest did not welcome them. Even in small groups, they felt isolated, each step carrying them deeper into shadows that seemed to shift and breathe. Sounds that had been ordinary, owl calls, rustling leaves, distant brook, now had a sharpness, a hidden meaning that made every man glance over his shoulder, searching for a threat that refused to materialize. At first, the incidents were subtle. A footstep that did not belong to any hunter, a twig snapping just beyond the lantern's glow. One man, Thomas Grady, swore he saw a figure crouched near a tree, hunched and still, only to turn the beam of his lantern and find nothing. His companions laughed it off, attributing it to exhaustion, the mind playing tricks. But as hours passed, these occurrences grew more frequent and less easily dismissed. Lanterns flickered without cause. Mist seemed to rise suddenly, curling around boots and ankles, as if the earth itself were aware of their presence. Voices began to carry differently. A shout calling for a friend would return not from the intended direction, but from deep within the trees, distorted and elongated, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, never the voice they had expected. A laugh, strange and hollow, would drift on the wind, far from any human origin. The men huddled together, whispering, measuring distance and direction, but the forest seemed to push them apart, dispersing their formation in a way that eroded both trust and courage. Food and water, once plentiful, became a source of tension. A bag of provisions left unattended might be empty the next moment. Streams that should have offered sustenance were cold and stagnant, their surfaces broken by ripples that suggested movement beneath the surface, though no fish or creature was ever caught. Even the air seemed altered, carrying faint odors of decay, iron, and something faintly sweet, as though the forest were testing their senses, challenging their perception of what was safe, what was real. Campfires, when lit, refused to burn steadily. Sparks leapt into the night, only to vanish, embers turning black before they could illuminate more than a small circle of ground. Smoke hung in still columns, then shifted in unnatural patterns, revealing glimpses of shapes. Twisted limbs, crouching figures, faces that seemed familiar, and yet impossible. Men would blink, and the vision was gone, leaving only the forest and the fog, heavier than ever. Sleep was fragmented, restless. Each man attempted to close his eyes, to rest, but dreams were invaded by fragments of the forest itself, whispers, shadows, glimpses of something moving between the trees just out of reach. Waking moments offered no relief. Every rustle, every sigh of wind, every distant cry set nerves taut, forcing men to clutch rifles, to huddle closer to companions who might already be gone. Fear, subtle and insidious, began to replace caution. The hunters began to argue, blame, and retreat from one another, small fissures widening into fractures of trust. Strange phenomena continued to manifest. Lanterns that had been lit were suddenly extinguished without cause. Footprints appeared and disappeared in the soft soil, sometimes showing 30 sets of men. Sometimes only one tree's bore markings, scratches deep and deliberate that seemed to form patterns, circles, lines, symbols whose meaning eluded every observer. Some hunters swore they saw eyes in the darkness, pairs of luminescent eyes, tracking movement from a distance, never blinking, never wavering. By the third day, the forest's influence became undeniable. Directions lost meaning. Paths that had been followed now circled back on themselves. Compasses wavered inexplicably. Men became disoriented, feeling as though they had been walking for hours while remaining within the same square meter of forest floor. Murmurs of panic began to surface, though no one admitted the depth of fear they felt. The idea of turning back was fleeting, almost unthinkable. A subtle, inexorable pressure seemed to push them forward, deeper into the heart of the woods, where clarity and reason failed. Communication became strained. A man's call to a companion often went unanswered, or elicited a sound that was wrong. A voice higher, lower, or stretched unnaturally long, carrying an emotion foreign to the caller. Shadows seemed to respond to movement rather than light. Branches bent slightly when approached, only to straighten moments later. Mist would rise around a hunter's legs, then disperse, revealing nothing, leaving a chill that seeped into the soul rather than the skin. Small, inexplicable accidents began to occur. One hunter tripped over nothing, crashing into the undergrowth, a rifle skittering out of reach. Another, seeking water at a stream, leaned too far over the bank and fell, only to find himself scraping mud and leaves with no source of injury. Yet panic seized him. Lanterns were dropped, hands scratched by branches, clothing snagged, all seemingly orchestrated by an unseen force, guiding events as if the forest itself were alive and intent on control. One man, Caleb Warren, described hearing his own name, whispered from the shadows. He called to his companions, expecting reply, but instead only silence returned, punctuated by the faintest rustling in the trees. When he moved toward the sound, the forest shifted, confusing distance and direction. A tree that had been distant now loomed just ahead, roots twisting as though reaching for him. Panic mounted. His companions attempted to reassure him, but every man began to sense the same subtle manipulation, the same impossible disorientation. The woods were no longer merely a setting. They had become a participant, watching, measuring, influencing, waiting. By now, the hunters' unity had fractured. Men who had marched side by side now found themselves isolated. Groups of 2 or 3 wandered off in search of the rest, leaving gaps, only to realize they had been walking in circles. Footprints left in soft soil disappeared or duplicated themselves. The forest seemed to create illusions of pathways, false openings, and corridors of undergrowth that trapped men within its maze. Whispers, laughter, and faint cries echoed through the trees, often impossible to locate, yet impossibly close. Each man felt pursued, watched, tested, their nerves raw, their courage fraying. And still, none turned back. Pride, fear, confusion, or compulsion drove them forward, deeper into the unknown. The forest, patient and unyielding, seemed to push them toward an unseen center, a place where answers might exist, but survival was not guaranteed. Shadows grew more pronounced, sounds more distorted, and the sense of being observed became overwhelming. Even the bravest began to falter. Sleep, rest, clarity, all were denied. Only the forest remained, indifferent yet active, shaping events subtly, weaving disorientation and dread into every step, every breath, every glance into the dimming light. By nightfall of the 3rd day, some hunters had vanished, leaving only echoes and the faint glimmer of lanterns that would never return. Others, disoriented, stumbled into traps of their own fear, misjudging distance, misinterpreting shadows, and hearing voices where none existed. The forest had begun its silent work, separating, isolating, eroding confidence, breaking the group until only fragments remained. The deeper they walked, the less they resembled the men who had laughed at warnings just days before. The Ozark woods had begun to claim them, not with visible monsters, but with an invisible, patient force that preyed on mind and spirit rather than flesh. This was the beginning of the legend. 30 hunters entered the Missouri Ozarks in 1888. None returned. Not because of wolves, not because of accident, not even because of exposure alone. They disappeared into a forest that had been watching, waiting, and manipulating. They became part of the wood's record, whispers in the wind, shadows in the mist, echoes of human curiosity and human arrogance forever imprinted in the trees. Would you have the courage to walk through these woods alone, knowing 30 men vanished here? Comment yes or no, if you dare. By the fourth night, the forest had become almost a living presence. Every step the hunters took seemed to echo back at them, but not as a sound. They heard their own fear reflected in the wind, in the shifting mist, in shadows that moved against the natural flow of trees. Lanterns now seemed to illuminate not just the forest floor, but outlines of things that should not exist. Elongated shapes crouched in the undergrowth, impossible angles of limbs, forms that resembled men, but with features twisted as though reflected in water over stone. It was James Whitaker, one of the younger hunters, who first screamed. A faint cry had pierced the quiet night, faint enough to be dismissed, but something in his tone drew the others' attention. When they reached him, he pointed, trembling, toward a gap in the trees. There, half hidden behind the trunks, was movement, a figure that was almost human, yet impossible. It mimicked James's gestures, copying them slowly, deliberately. When he waved, it waved. When he turned his head, it tilted in perfect synchrony, though its face remained obscured by shadows deeper than the darkness around it. No man spoke. Each hunter's heartbeat became deafening. The forest seemed to constrict, the air thicker, heavier. A sound arose from the distance, soft footfalls, numerous, but moving in ways that defied natural coordination. It was as if the trees themselves walked, or perhaps the forest had claimed shapes of the hunters themselves to haunt the remaining group. Lantern light caught glimpses of forms with elongated fingers, hunched backs, and faces pale and blank, staring without eyes. The hunters turned to flee, but paths that had seemed clear twisted before them, looping endlessly, the forest an intricate maze of shifting branches and shadows. One man, Henry Kells, ran blindly into a thick thicket. The others followed, lanterns bouncing in the fog. There they discovered footprints, dozens, overlaid upon one another in patterns that made no sense. Some prints were impossibly large, others tiny, all weaving through the same narrow path, as if multiple entities had walked simultaneously. And then came the sound. Whispers. Voices of friends, familiar names, echoing all around them, calling from places where no one could be. When they turned, the shapes dissolved, but the voices persisted, haunting, indistinguishable, carrying an accusation. They had entered the forest unprepared. The hunters' fear now reached a physical intensity. Eyes darted constantly, searching for the source of every motion. Mist swirled around ankles and knees, rising as they walked, revealing silhouettes that vanished when confronted. A low, humming vibration seemed to emanate from the ground itself, a resonance that pressed against bones, making heads ache and hearts race. Shadows moved against the wind. Trees seemed to bend subtly, just enough to obscure vision or mislead a step. Lanterns flickered not with draught, but with intention, casting light that made normal shapes appear monstrous. In the deepest part of the woods, a clearing appeared, a small natural depression. The hunters stumbled into it, exhausted, haggard, eyes wide with disbelief. The ground was scarred, footprints pressed deep into soft soil, some human, some elongated, some incomprehensible. In the center lay remnants of their own belongings, knives, flasks, coats, all carefully arranged, as though the forest itself had collected them. And then the shadows in the corners of the clearing moved with deliberate speed, coalescing into forms. Figures emerged, half visible, half imagined. The hunters could not tell if they were men, specters, or the very forest taking shape. One by one, men screamed and vanished from sight, swallowed into darkness that was neither night nor shadow, a void that responded to presence and intention. Lanterns fell, and the circle of light narrowed until only a few men remained. Shapes lunged and shifted, appearing both in front and behind. Yet steps toward escape brought them deeper into the same patterns, whispers intensified. Cries of friends, taunts, names twisted by fear. And then, a single sound, a low, guttural repetition of their own voice, distorted, calling their deepest regrets, their hidden fears, their insecurities, echoing through the forest like a second heartbeat. By dawn, the forest seemed calm, deceptively quiet. The mist lifted slightly, revealing signs that 30 men had once passed this way, but now only scattered belongings remained. The trees stood unmoving, yet in the wind the faintest echo could be heard, a laugh, soft and unplaceable, as if 30 voices had been folded into one. And in that quiet, the forest held its secret. Men had entered, never to leave, their absence preserved in the endless whispers, the twisted shadows, the footprints that no natural process could explain. The Ozark woods had claimed them fully, not just their bodies, but their certainty, their courage, their very understanding of the world outside. Even today, the clearing remains. No man ventures there willingly. Those who accidentally stumble upon it describe the same disorientation, the same impossible shifting of paths, the same soft, echoing voices. Few stay long. The legend survives not only because 30 men disappeared, but because the forest, patient and vast, continues to test every intruder, shaping reality itself to challenge perception, sanity, and courage. If you were here, would you continue forward? Or would the forest take you too? Comment forward or turn back. When the sun finally rose over the Missouri Ozarks, the forest seemed ordinary once more. Birds chirped, the wind rustled gently through the leaves, and the morning light cut cleanly through the trees. But to those who understood what had occurred, or survived the edges of it, the woods were forever altered. Not in shape, not in form, but in essence. 30 men had entered, and though the forest appeared calm, its memory remained. It kept the record of their terror, their confusion, their last moments, and the story of their disappearance would echo for generations. Local hunters, those who had avoided the ill-fated group, spoke in whispers. They told of how the forest seemed to hum on quiet nights, carrying faint echoes of 30 voices in unison. Sometimes the voices were pleading, sometimes accusing. Some men swore that on rare evenings, lanterns flickered deep in the woods, far from any path, as if someone, some entity, was trying to guide the curious or the foolish into the forest's heart. And those who ventured too close sometimes returned, but forever changed. Haunted eyes, endless nightmares, stories of shapes that moved independently of reality, of whispers that knew secrets the listener never spoke aloud. Families of the missing hunters never gave up hope entirely. But even decades later, nothing explained the disappearances. Trails returned to the earth, streams shifted, and moss-covered paths that had once been trampled by boots. Every clue seemed to vanish as quickly as it appeared. Yet some remnants remained. A boot in a creek, a lantern half buried in mud, a hand-carved hunting knife lying on a hill that no human foot had passed. They were puzzles that teased, fragments of a story that could never be completed. For those who study the Ozarks, the case has become a cautionary tale, repeated in local lore and dark storytelling circles. Scholars, folklorists, and paranormal researchers debate endlessly about what claimed the hunters. Some suggest natural phenomena, disorientation, wildlife, harsh terrain. But these explanations fail to account for the accounts of moving shapes, repeated whispers, the consistent return to the same clearing, and the eerily preserved items left behind. Others, less skeptical, claim the forest itself is a living entity, aware of trespassers and capable of manipulating perception, guiding men into confusion and terror. Survivors, if such survivors existed, are never identified in historical records. The story is told in fragments, passed down orally, documented in journals and letters, each account tinged with fear, uncertainty, and reverence for the power of the woods. Every detail, every anomaly, every fragmentary sighting serves as a warning. The Ozark woods are patient. They wait, they observe, and they remember. 30 men may have been taken in 1888, but the memory of them and the lessons of their arrogance remain alive. As you sit there, perhaps watching from the comfort of your home, the story may feel distant. But consider this: forests, mountains, and abandoned paths have histories written in echoes. The whispers of the past can reach into the present. The same winds that carried the cries of 30 hunters may brush your ear tonight. Shadows may shift at the corner of your vision, and a sense of unease, subtle, persistent, may remind you that curiosity, when untamed, carries consequences beyond understanding. The forest does not forget. It does not forgive. It does not release those who enter unprepared. And for every story like the hunters of 1888, there remains an unfinished sentence in the annals of the woods, a record of fear, a reminder of mortality, and a challenge to the audacity of human curiosity. You have heard their tale. You have imagined their terror. And though the forest may never reach you through your screen, the thought lingers. What would happen if you ventured into the Ozark woods tonight, alone, in the dark? So the story ends, or perhaps it continues. 30 men, lost to time, their fates entwined with the shadows, the mist, the whispers of the forest, and the forest waits, always waits, watching, remembering, silent, patient, eternal. Do you think the forest still holds the souls of those hunters? Comment your thoughts, and if you're brave enough, share where you'd explore next.